So thank you everyone for being here this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Dr. Marlon Johnson, and I am a professor of counselor education at Seminary of the Southwest, but I also serve as your professional development chair here for Counselors for Social Justice. Today we have a presentation titled Identifying Generational Trauma and Facilitating Generational Healing in Black Families and Communities. I'm so excited to welcome you all in and to give you a couple of housekeeping tips. We will have closed captioning available for you all at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So feel free if you would like to use that to toggle that as you see fit. We'll also have our chat feature available and open for you all. If you'd like to put your questions in there throughout the chat, we will be monitoring that and attending to that as need be throughout this presentation, but we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers as best as we can. Near the end of this presentation, I will be putting inside of our chat our survey for your CE credits. This will provide you all with 1 hour of continuing education credit. So if you fill out that survey, I will be able to provide you all with certificates at a later date. And again, we are recording this presentation, so you'll be able to find it later on our Counselors for Social Justice YouTube channel. So if you're curious or you have some notes and you want to look for it later, we'll make sure it's there, as well as send out any copies of the slides that you all are curious to review at a later date. Of course, if you have any questions for me or you have any logistical issues, feel free to check in with Counselors for Social Justice. So, with that being said, I would like to introduce our panelists or our presenters for this afternoon. First, we have Dr. Ashley Petian. Dr. Ashley Petian is a licensed professional counselor and an assistant professor of clinical mental health counseling at Nova Southeastern University in the College of Psychology. Dr. Petian's clinical experiences span generational trauma and healing, suicide prevention and intervention, crisis response, culture-centered and trauma-informed care, as well as LGBTQ+ concerns. Dr. Petian's research interests include generational trauma and healing, culture-centered group work, and participatory action research-based research through qualitative and mixed methodologies. In addition to clinical and research work, Dr. Petian is also an active member of several professional counseling organizations, including ACA, CSI, AMCD, all within which she has served in various leadership roles. We also have Dieta Greenwich, who is a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia. Dieta's clinical specialty includes working with children and adolescents that have experienced trauma, anxiety, depression, or suicidal ideation. And she is involved in suicide prevention work as a nationally certified instructor in question, persuade, and refer suicide prevention training and a mental health first aid national instructor. Dieta is a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia, working on her dissertation that focuses on race-based traumatic stress of Black women in higher educational spaces using liberation approaches. Her research interests include trauma within marginalized populations, racial stress fatigue, and identifying culturally competent interventions for marginalized individuals in counseling. We also have Marcia Roundtree, who is the owner and counselor of Giving Grace Counseling, LLC, focusing on trauma and the intersection of mental health and finances. Marcia is the senior staff clinician at Agnes Scott College and a doctoral student at the University of Georgia's Counselor Education and Supervision program. She completed the Master's of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling from Georgia State University and attended workshops and curricula about trauma while there. She developed a focus on trauma work and completed the virtual trauma competency training facilitated by Dr. Melinda Page. While completing her baccalaureate in psychology, Marcia participated in the Ronald E. McNair's post-baccalaureate achievement program, and her research experience focused on the barriers that impact African-American males seeking mental health help. She is a current member of Chi Sigma Iota, the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, and the Southern Association for Counselor Education and Supervision. Thank you all so much for sharing your information, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. We are so excited to share our work with you. We are going to be sharing some clinical impressions, but also a little bit about the research that we've conducted. And so we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about why we got into this work before we move forward. We also wanted to have you write into the chat. We like to know who we're talking to. And so if you could take a few moments to write into the chat, let us know your role or your title, where you're located, and the population you primarily serve. And we have a little example here of what that could look like. So while you all are introducing yourselves into the chat, I'll just share a little bit about my background. Dr. Johnson already told you about all the accolades and all the things, but I really got into doing generational trauma work because when I was a master's student in my internship, I was working with children and adolescents in school-based mental health settings. And it was from the perspective of that adolescent, that student, that teenager. And a lot of times I was coming across the clinical situation of a parent, a teacher, someone in the school bringing the kid to me and saying, fix this kid, they're out of control, right? And that's the message that I was getting a lot of times when working with these adolescents and their families, of them being the identified patient, the identified client, and being positioned as such, and treatment kind of revolving around them. But as I got deeper into my work, I realized that it didn't start with them. The issues that they were presenting with were much bigger than them. And what I mean by that is that there were some generational processes going on, things that they were learning or inheriting from their parents, their grandparents within their communities, that maybe they weren't totally aware of and privy to, but I was able to kind of see those patterns. And I remember asking that question in supervision, like, what do I do with this? And my supervisor saying, this sounds like a great topic for a dissertation, and encouraging me to go on to my doctoral studies, which I ended up doing. So I really saw this a lot in clinical work. And as I learned more about this topic, the little bit of research that there was out there about it at the time, recognized that I have some of my own generational trauma. I identify as a Black woman. And I wanted to shout out, I see my grandma in here. So thank you for popping in. I wasn't expecting to see you. So thank you, Grandma, for popping in and wanting to learn more. But I do, have some things that run in my family that I've had to work through my own personal counseling and things like that. And so, again, a professional connection to this, a personal connection. And of course, we're going to talk about our research. So Dieta and Marcia, do you want to talk a little bit about your connections to this work as well before we see who's in the chat?
Yes, I'll be very brief. So I'm similar to Ashley, just I've seen it a lot in my clinical experiences. So I work mostly with children and adolescents. And a lot of times when I'm working with my presenting client, I realize there's a lot of system-based issues, meaning it has resulted from the family. And then my own personal experiences. And then I joined Ashley when she was working on her pre-dissertation. And we worked on looking at Black women and their intergenerational trauma. So I just have grown a passion with research. I have seen it in clinical experience and then my own personal experience. And that's kind of what brings me here today.
Yes, and piggybacking off of Dieta, it was the same for me for a personal experience that I had with trauma and then with generational trauma as I understood it to be, coming from a lens and a background where we didn't understand generational trauma was a thing. We, growing up in the South, called it, curses. And we were very familiar with that term, that it was just a curse of the family. And as I continued to go through school, getting the language, understanding what that was, that it was generational trauma, I developed more of a passion for it, just from my own lived experiences. And the research that I've done in my undergrad, I was seeing a lot of trauma and generational trauma, specifically amongst the Black men I was interviewing during my time as a Ronald E. McNair scholar. And then as I got to my master's program, just going to workshops and finding out more information, reading more books about it. And then as luck would have it, Ashley and I crossed paths at Georgia State, and I was able to be a part of her work during her dissertation phase, and working with her in that generational trauma amongst Black millennial Black women. So that's how I got connected to the work, and I continue to be inspired and connected to the work after today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. We find that important to note because we don't, in our graduate programs and counseling, we don't have generational trauma courses. Sometimes we have trauma courses, and even those aren't required, right? And so this is not a topic that comes up a whole lot in our training. So we found it important to identify like our connection to this work and kind of set the tone for that. Thank you all for checking into the chat. It looks like we have quite a few counselor educators in the room. We've got some folks doing some clinical work, so that's really good. And so we want to, we're going to be talking about today, let's get to that. We're going to do, I'm going to briefly talk about the literature, what's out there about generational trauma and generational healing, specifically within Black families and communities. I see quite a few of you, I think there was Dawn in the chat, who mentioned working with Korean Americans. And so you'll find, I'll touch on what GT, how it's been addressed in other populations, but we are going to hone in on Black families and communities today, but you might find that some of the interventions and the approaches that we talk about could be helpful for you as well. And then we'll talk about signs and symptoms of what it might look like in the counseling room, how to spot it, right? Since we don't yet have any formal assessments for generational trauma. And then we're going to talk about some concrete strategies for treating generational trauma and facilitating generational healing with our Black clients. Okay, so we're going to address what it could look like at the individual level. If you have a couple coming in, families coming in, and we'll even talk about some group interventions and things like that, depending on the type of modalities that you work with within your settings. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to kind of breeze through this because I'm looking at the time. It's my understanding that you are going to get a copy of the slides at the end, and in this PowerPoint or this recording will be made available. So you can feel free to peruse the literature, but I wanted to just touch on some of the major things to provide some context and background to the clinical pieces that we're talking about today. So what is generational trauma? And there are many definitions out there. And the one that I like that sticks out to me the most is this idea of generational trauma being a complex and collective trauma experienced over time and across generations, shared by a group of people with a common identity, affiliation, or circumstance, right? And so you got quite a few references there. You also might see other terms in the literature or in conversation. Sometimes we have prefixes added to it, such as intergenerational trauma, transgenerational trauma, right? And those just indicate the direction of transmission. So inter being like both ways, or to trans being across. And so you just see any of those acronyms or terms used to describe. There's also historical trauma, which really focuses on the historical aspect of how trauma is passed down, whereas the previous two might focus on more contemporary challenges. And then collective trauma is really used to really hone in on like a specific group identity. So some of these terms might be used interchangeably, but for the purpose of today, we'll talk about generational trauma, and you'll see that acronym GT across our PowerPoint. So when we get into the literature about the transmission of generational trauma, that's like how it is passed down from generation to generation within families. There's always this like nature versus nurture debate, if you will. And I don't like to acknowledge it as a debate because it's more so that all these things are happening at once, right? And so on the nature side of things, we know through research that our gene expression is actually modified epigenetically. And this is caused by external environmental factors such as trauma, right? So we know that trauma changes the way that our genes express themselves, and that affects physiological systems that influence our functioning, our behavior, how we interact with people. So on a very like physiological, biological level, there are changes happening to our bodies when we experience trauma. Those things make changes within us, and we pass those changes on to our offspring. On the nurture side of things, we know that socialization and modeling processes such as parenting, family dynamics, kinship ties, even schooling and other community factors impact how we interact with the next generation, and that changes how they are socialized. And we also know that there are quite a few empirical sources or empirical evidence for this social transmission of GT. But then we also have a lot of like anecdotal sources of knowledge, which I know in the academic world doesn't hold a whole lot of weight. But if you are like me and you've been in counseling sessions where folks are talking about this at length and they're describing their experiences, we know that there is a lot of anecdotal sources for the transmission of generational trauma at the social level. So all this being said, we acknowledge that there is a mixture of nature versus nurture going on in terms of how trauma is passed down within families and communities. Populations that has been studied in, I love to talk about the non-human studies. One specifically was conducted with mice. And so this, you can visit this reference at the end to learn more about that. But really what they found was that the offspring of a group of mice were affected by the trauma that, their parents experienced. So basically, in short, what they did was they created a really traumatic like startle response in one group of mice, and they found that their children and their grandchildren, they're called grandpups for mice, their grandpups actually expressed or exhibited fear of that certain stimulus without ever having been exposed to it in the same way. And so that was a really big study for the transmission of the generational traumas as it relates to epigenetics. And so that was a big study that showed in non-human subjects that even we see this transmission of trauma happening at a very biological level. In human studies, so we have quite a few of those. War veterans, there is a study out there that shows that infants of war veterans, okay, so these infants haven't gone to war themselves, right? But their parents who went to war, were affected, their gene expressions modified, those sorts of things. And their infants had a greater startle response than non-war veteran parents, right? So that is also interesting to know. They just got here, they're fresh out the womb, and they already have a greater startle response than other groups. And so that really stood out. Other groups, a lot of the generational trauma literature started with Holocaust survivors and their offspring. There was an influx of those folks coming into counseling in the 50s and 60s. And so counselors started to wonder, like, well, they didn't experience it, but there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of like social transmission of this trauma. And so a lot of the historical trauma literature is centered around Holocaust survivors and their offspring. We've also got a lot of data from famine and disaster survivors, even pregnant women, to talk about the impact of trauma on the womb and that sort of thing. So there's different pockets and populations and conversations about what has been happening in terms of epigenetic modification, social transmission, and those sorts of things. Also, these other ethnic groups, you can imagine that there are some historical implications of what they've experienced in terms of genocide, discrimination, racism, all the isms, right? And so I put some references here for you to be able to reference that. And then I want to, again, like I said, we're going to hone in on African Americans or Black Americans to talk about what it looks like for this specific population. So just a little snapshot, we know that Black Americans make up 13.4% of the US population. However, we make up 37.7% of prison inmates, 31% of children in poverty, and we are twice as likely to die from heart disease. And this is just a snapshot of the health and social disparities of Black folks in the US. So we're making up a small percentage of the population, but as it relates to some of these more detrimental experiences in the US, we are overrepresented, right? And so we start to wonder the impact of cultural trauma and how this might, show up as generational trauma. So there are quite a few studies that address collective memory and how that leads to a specific sense of identity formation and a sense of self within individual Black Americans, but also that contribute to this collective memory. One of my favorite articles that really kind of catapulted me into wanting to do this research was an article titled Residual Effects of Slavery by Wilkins and colleagues back in 2013. And they really, if you read nothing else, or if you look at no other references aside from our publications, I recommend looking at this one. It really does get into what generational trauma can look like or has looked like within families and communities. One of the main things that stuck out to me from this article was this idea of contemporary Black parents and Black families wanting to create home conditions that are so oppressive with the idea of helping to prepare those children for, being successfully socialized. So the narrative there is, I know that the world is hard and racist on Black children. And so if I make my home hard to survive, like they'll be good in the real world, right? That's the narrative and that's the logic. We know that there are some challenges with that. We'll get into those. But this article really breaks down what it could look like. And oppressive home conditions is one of those things. There's also a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. It's by Dr. Joy DeGraw. Anybody heard of it before? If you haven't heard of it, I recommend it. We'll talk about that in some references as well at the end. But it's a book where Dr. DeGraw explores the multi-generational transmission of trauma. She actually talks about her trip and her time in West Africa and like making connections to her present day social work clients in the US. So we start to see like all these terms forming, and clinicians and academics talking about this term and what the transmission looked like. And we also start to explore what it might look like to interrupt this process. So a little bit more about residual effects of slavery. It just acknowledges that the impact of slavery continues to shape societal dynamics for Black Americans. There is a piece about like dehumanization and the belief of inferiority. We see this a lot with kids in school. I'm automatically bad at math. I'm a bad kid. I don't deserve the same thing. We see those types of narratives in kids inherent in them. And so we, of course, as clinicians work to combat those things, but we often see it show up as powerlessness, right? And oftentimes what that means is that oftentimes Black Americans are moving through life very passively as a survival technique, right? This is all I have energy for, passivity, right? There's a bit of identity conflict with that as well. We talk about the both and of being African American, right? And how our, ethnic group, our cultural group, it tends to be more collectivistic. So, putting the needs of the group and the family first. But then we live in this American Western society that is very individualistic. And so there's tension about our identities of who we are, where we're located, and how we navigate our relationships. And then in general, residual effects of slavery talks about like a general cultural mistrust towards white folks. Socialization, we talked about some of this, the oppressive home conditions. We also, they also address how a fear of loss kind of gives way to difficulty giving praise. How many of you like experience families where like you got a good grade and nobody said nothing to you because that's what you were supposed to do? You don't get a pat on the back for getting an A because, right? And so this article makes connections between slavery and back in the day, if there was an infant, or let's talk about the present day. So if I have an infant and they take their first step, my first inclination is probably to get my phone out, to cheer, to clap, to get them to do it again, to keep walking. Like it's exciting. They took their first steps, right? Well, back in the day, during slavery times, if your infant could walk, that means that they could work. And so if you see them take that first step, we don't want to reinforce that. We don't want them to continue doing that. So we're not going to give them no praise for that, to try to keep them a baby as long as possible, because if they can work, that means they might be ripped away from us. It's a fear of loss. And so over time, we see this as a connection between present day, like difficulty giving praise, right? And this is a residual effect of slavery. We also touched on the tension between collectivism and individualism. So this is the book that I was mentioning. I won't spend too much time here, but you'll have the reference at the end as well. Highly recommend. And then the Bowen Center, you all are probably, if you took your family counseling class, you are familiar with Murray Bowen and all his work related to multi-generational transmission processes. And this really just gets at the idea of these small interactions that we have on a daily basis, how they merge together to really create like this differentiation among members, and then these multi-generational effects that we see today. And this happens through our child rearing, socialization. And then we also have this concept from the Bowen Center of homeostasis, right? So we know that's like a scientific word for like molecules wanting to stay the same, but we also see that socially, right? And how oftentimes when we work with an individual client and we send them back into their family, into their system, into their community, they're one person. They're like one part of the machine, and it's really hard to get the entire machine, the entire family system to change because of homeostasis, or this desire to, or inclination to want to stay the same because it's comfortable, right? And so the Bowen Center also hones on homeostasis quite a bit. So a closer look, we conducted a study a few years back that was just recently published. And we did some phenomenological individual interviews. What that means is that we just really explored meaning making for individuals that experience generational trauma. And we actually co-constructed some family genograms with them. So this was a lot of fun. Well, let me not say fun because it was some heavy topics, but it was enlightening. And some of the themes that we discovered were feeling that they belong to a collectivistic system, but also feeling disconnected, right? So I have this honor and duty to my family. My mom is my best friend, but she don't really know me. Like there's so many pieces of me that, I feel disconnected from my family about, right? Avoidance. So just a lack of wanting to talk about this stuff in general. Functioning and dysfunctioning. And this theme was all about a lot of the participants finding out or really realizing that some of the things that they were experiencing within their families that were normal to them were not normal at large, right? And so maybe they were exposed to someone, a childhood friend, or when they went to college, they learned about what, a functional, healthy family looks like, those sorts of things. We also learned about some gender differences. We only interviewed Black women, but they were also led to reflect on like maybe how things might be different for themselves versus their male counterparts. And so we talked about women kind of being considered the glue of the family and being responsible for initiating emotional conversations and things like that. But above all else, we did find that these individuals wanted to change their family's homeostasis, and that just talking about it in the context of this interview really increased their desire to want to repair their relationships. And so I will admit, I can't speak for my co-presenters, but I know for myself at the end of this study, I felt a little bit of researcher guilt, right? Because basically what we did is we just kind of dredged up all this meaning, like, okay, what's wrong with your family? Like, how is it passed down? What does generational trauma look and feel like to you? And at the end, they were like, okay, what do we do? Like, we're ready to work. Like, how do we fix this? How do we change? How do we grow? That kind of thing. And that's what our subsequent study was focused on. And so we actually facilitated a group for millennial Black women to be able to connect with each other and learn from each other. And we did this through a participatory action-based support group. And we were really interested in their self-efficacy, or it's a fancy word for confidence, regarding how they might feel comfortable addressing generational trauma within their families as they participated in this group. And so we found some themes overall. This is actually my dissertation, so it's like 200 pages of research compiled into a couple minutes, but you have the reference there. We found that just simply being part of the group helps to deepen their awareness of what it looks and feels like to experience this phenomenon. That intentional community piece, not only seeking out this group, but even like within subsets of their own families and communities. Similar to the previous theme of functioning and dysfunction, we found that they really wanted to abnormalize what was considered normal. So for example, patterns of sexual assault within their family. A lot of folks spoke about that as if it was normal. It was an experience for a lot of folks in the group, but they wanted to put a stake in the sand to say, this is not normal. We shouldn't be experiencing this, right? We found that they were exposed to the complexity of generational trauma. Maybe they came in with a lot of confidence about how they might deal with it, but being exposed to other people's scenarios, their family situations, had them thinking like, hold up, this is a big beast. This is a lot bigger than maybe what we anticipated. And so that led to them turning inward and taking action, or wanting to take action within the context of their families, of their relationships, to really take accountability for how they might be contributing to this transmission of generational trauma and how they can contribute to the interruption of it as well. So we kind of like massaged our researcher guilt here and we provided a space to kind of work through those things and have a foundation for individuals to begin their healing journey as it relates to generational trauma. I wanted to share this quote that stuck out to me from a participant. It says, my emotional IQ, or like emotional intelligence, for generational trauma ain't up there yet, because I'm trying to unlearn and relearn at the same time. I've been working on it, and it's definitely a skill you got to do every day, right? So this is a participant reflecting on their experience in the group, acknowledging that although they feel they're not doing the best yet, they know that it's an unlearning process, a relearning process, and that it's something that, occurs every day. We also wanted to just provide a slide about generational resilience. I know when we talk about trauma a lot, it can feel like we are really focusing on the deficits of this community, of these groups. But it's also important to acknowledge some of the adaptive behaviors that have kept us alive, right? Quite literally and figuratively, how we have relentless hopefulness for the future. We heard that in our participants. We see that in our community every day. I don't know about y'all, but I have been like cackling at the responses to what happened in Montgomery a few days ago. Our community, we just use humor to cope through things. We're here, okay? So we have a lot of resilience, and we have extended support networks. Like we have positive things that can contribute to the interruption of generational trauma, but it's up to us to kind of enact those things and help foster them within a clinical setting. So what we'll do is talk about how you can spot it within session. I'm going to pass the mic to Marcia.
Yes, and so for the sake of time, normally in this area, I'd like to be engaged and have you guys unmute your mics. But if we can, just have you guys respond to the question in the chat. So the question, just as we talk about signs and symptoms, is what do you see in the counseling room as it comes to or relates to signs and symptoms of generational trauma, and what do you are seeing or have seen in your personal experiences? And as we are waiting on you guys to respond in the chat, let me also point out that as we talk about signs and symptoms, that I want us to understand and sit with that African Americans are going to respond differently to generational trauma. So some of the signs and symptoms that we may talk about and highlight may not be an exhaustive list or may not pertain to everyone, because we are a diverse group of people. So we have diverse responses to how we handle trauma or how we respond to certain traumas. All right, so we're getting there. Oh, we got fear, feelings of betrayal and anger. Yes. Symptoms that present to clients are unexplainable, or I shouldn't feel that way because it didn't happen to me. Definitely got, some of those responses during our facilitation of the group. I also hear that here at Agnes Scott, about to say Georgia State. I also hear that as well when I talk to my clients here at Agnes Scott. Is like, there's an unexplainable of like, I shouldn't feel, insert feeling here. I shouldn't feel that way because this didn't happen to me. Slavery didn't happen to me. Segregation didn't happen to me. But yet identifying that there's something here. There's still something in my present being that I am experiencing. Yes, mistrust, gaslighting of self. Oh, yes. Displacement of guilt. Yes. Clients not knowing what they are experiencing are symptoms of trauma. Yes, absolutely. So we're going to go to the next slide here and talk about observations of generational trauma in the counseling room. And this is just to highlight some of those things that we've seen in children and adolescents. Now, this is not to look at this and say that they're in the developmental model of children, right? When we're looking at their developmental arc. These are some of the things that are just out of the abnormal or out of the norm of what we see developmentally. So like in poor emotional regulation, this could be anger outbursts, not knowing how to regulate self and come back to center, low self-esteem. We see this in the prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline. And this just highlights, how some of those standardized tests can feel like a setup for the African-American community to further, push us along, like rules, certain rules and regulations, how African Americans are highly or disproportionately punished, right, than their white counterparts in schools. So we're seeing some behaviors in African American children being punished at a higher rate, risky behaviors in suicide, repeating behaviors in dynamics of parents and grandparents. So some of these behaviors that we see in children, again, these are not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that we were able to highlight and point out. When we're talking about this on an individual, like individual adults, what they may come to the counseling room with is just presenting concerns like that of my family life, concerns with focusing on tumultuous relationships. They're coming in seeking to figure out, how do I cope with my relationship with my mom, with my grandmother, because these relationships, we tend to have kinships, right, in the African American community. So this is how we are formed, is through our kinships and through our community and togetherness. And so when we're talking about our clients showing up, sometimes they're showing up reporting that they're having difficulty in these relationships. They're having difficulty forming romantic relationships as well, because we're not knowing how to regulate emotions, not knowing how to regulate self. We're seeing that it's reported of the cutoff or the estrangement. So we're seeing that, I can't deal with such and such, so I'm completely cutting them off. So that avoidance is very high, where we're not knowing how to have a repair of rupture in relationships. We're also seeing this in the unofficial family role. So you have the person that is the clown or the goofy one, right? The mediator, the person that is overextending themselves in a way in which to keep the family together, or the glue, if you will. You also have it where someone will report that they're the distant person or the distant cousin. Again, repeating that cutoff, right? And so, yeah, as Ashley says, if anyone is relating to that unofficial family role, like, how does that show up for you personally and for your clients sometimes? We also see how generational trauma can affect couples. So this could be where there's the impact of family disintegration. Definitely see this with my clients, where there's the clash of societal norms and family norms and values, right? So we're having it where there is this tension between the rules of what the woman is supposed to do versus the man, women-led households, and how that matriarchy and patriarchy tension is shown up in how we're supposed to relate to one another, and even the tension between individualism and collectivism. Am I supposed to look out for my kinship, for those that are in my circle or in my friend group, or am I supposed to have the adage of all skin folk and kinfolk? And that tension between individuals that show up there. We also see it as a resentment or a resentment over lack of protection from systems, from systemic factors. And we also see it as abuse, and that abuse looking like physical, emotional, mental, financial, right? Sexual abuse. So all of the abuse that comes up that we're highlighting here, this can show up from generational trauma, and just kind of going along with it, because this is how I first learned through being hit that this equals love. How we see and observe generational trauma in families. So this could be a hypervigilance of someone's whereabouts. Again, as Ashley touched on through back in the day in our slavery times, we had to know where our folks were. You have to know where that person is, because if they're out of sight, then they're highly likely to be in some kind of trouble. And knowing that in our African American communities, this was the case, especially when we're talking about Jim Crow South, where if your child was not home or not in your presence, more than likely something had happened to them. We're also seeing this in harsh and oppressive home conditions. As Ashley pointed out, difficulty giving praise, even with internalized racism as well, and the repetition of these patterns, despite having this new knowledge. And so here, as I talked about the signs and symptoms, I'm going to pass the mic over to Deetta, where she's going to talk about the treatments and intervention approaches.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to do so much in the chat and do the slides. Are you good, Deetta? Do you need the next slide?
Yes. So
Okay,
we are going to move on to treatment approaches and intervention. So we kind of looked at the signs and symptoms, and we also reviewed the literature. And so regarding treatment approaches, it is important that we first do some internal work. And so that means us as the counselor. So that can look like examining our own personal beliefs about our families and generational trauma and personal work. So that can be attending trainings such as this, joining a research team. So I know what I shared in the very beginning, I have my own personal experiences. And then I joined working with Ashley to understand more because I knew this was something I didn't truly understand. So those are some examples. And the reason why it is so important to do internal work is because we want to address any counter transfers that can occur. And I know also too, you just have to be able to process that with yourself so you're not bringing that into the room and kind of impeding your own client's treatment. And then for the clients, some treatment approaches that you can do as a counselor is help them acknowledge the stigma of seeking counseling, help them improve emotional regulation and self-esteem, and helping them reframe and develop positive racial socialization, meaning how do we talk about race? Of course, letting them know the contextual backgrounds, but of course, also giving a strength-based approach and reframing the perceptions that sometimes we are often told that can be in a negative light that can impact their self-regulation and their self-esteem. And then regarding what to do for some treatment interventions, it is important that we acknowledge with our clients that it did not start with them. It is something that they're battling that is a bigger system. So that's something that Ashley had mentioned before within her dissertation studies, that we had these women realizing that they wanted to work on their generational trauma, but it was so big. And that is the reality, and that is okay. And it's okay for you to normalize that for your client by letting them know that, you know, this can be done on an individual basis, and it's something that can be bigger than them. But the biggest thing is that we want to help them give voice to this phenomenon in their lives and hold space for them. And that goes into the second bullet point of normalizing, psychoeducating, and helping them with communication, nonviolent communication skills, and just increasing their self-awareness and personal contributions. So again, kind of looking back at the first bullet point, them acknowledging that's bigger than them, but them doing their own self-individual work, increasing their self-awareness to facilitate change is the way that we can begin to target generational trauma. And then a visual approach, which is something I love myself, is family genograms. So this is the actual treatment intervention you can do in session. This can help individuals identify family patterns such as substance use, abuse, interpersonal violence, traumatic events. And it is a visual representation of how patterns can be traced down through families. So I know in the study that I worked with Ashley, when they did create their genograms, they were able to see how different patterns, whether it was each family member in each generation had went to jail, or they had sexual assault, or they were dealing with toxic relationships. They were able to see that visually through a family genogram. And that's something I personally have done in my own clinical experience to kind of help my adult clients understand that, again, it did not start with them. And then this is something that is a continuing pattern. And then, of course, here's some other interventions that you can do. So bibliotherapy is a very powerful intervention as a counselor to do, because it will help them with empowerment and prevention for transmission to future generations. So here's some examples. So Ashley already mentioned post-traumatic slave syndrome. This would give you that psychoeducation, the contextual background about why you might be exhibiting the behaviors that you exhibit, or your family might be having these patterns and behaviors. Another book is Homegoing, What Happened to You, Drama Free. And within these bibliotherapies, again, it is a way for clients to really understand just some of that background, and again, how those patterns have passed down. And then also to TV shows and movies. So this is Us, Blackish, Greenleaf, and Canto. So this is examples of, let's say, even if you're working with children clients. So I would use this more for my children clients, because this helps them kind of understand how to take a non-directive approach to understanding why their family could be showing the patterns that they show. So this is something that can be used as an assignment or a task in session for them to kind of be able to see. or resonate with the character. So for example, if you're using Blacklist show, you can say, what character resonated with you and what would you like their future to look like? What might you say different to the next generation if you were this character? So it's a way to do a non-directive intervention without directly putting it on them. And then podcasts are very informative because again, that psychoeducation piece is a way that we can, again, increase our self-awareness and work towards addressing generational trauma. And then case management and multidisciplinary collaboration. So that can be like mentoring programs, so big sister, little sister groups, academic tutoring, workshops, advocacy. So again, not only the clients intending these things, but also to you as a counselor, just being aware of this and the benefits it can provide. And then I mentioned this before that intervention can be done at multiple levels. So individual, there is no finish line. There is no mastery of understanding intergenerational trauma because it is something that is, again, a system-based issue. And it's something that is based off some contextual history and some background. So of course, it is an ongoing journey. And what we stated in the previous slides is, again, psychoeducation, self-awareness, reframing, strength-based approaches is a way that you can start to target your generational trauma on an individual level. And there's no mastery to that. And then regarding couples intervention, setting positive examples, so couples counseling where you're working on relationship building, conflict resolution, healthy communication styles. Other interventions too that I'll add in here is couple workshops for healthy communication, not just going to therapy, but going to psychoeducational workshops can also help target that. If you know your family has a pattern of IPV or domestic violence and you want to break that cycle. And then family, generational trauma, you can go to family therapy and identify as a client and work on those issues as a family. And then what Ashley mentioned before in her dissertation is having a support group, a sample interview protocol and group curriculum. So again, that's where Ashley had that support group where we had Black women come together and talk about ways on how they can target and heal from that generational trauma and be the change. And so group is a very powerful intervention because it will normalize kind of the things they're going through, but also not just leave them stuck in that normalization, but also take the next step together and be able to help each other and collaborate with each other. So group is an amazing intervention. If maybe your client doesn't even know where to start, or they feel like they're good individually, but they want more collaboration with others, group can be a good intervention for them. And then,
Oh, go ahead, Deanna.
And then I didn't know if I was doing this one, but we also want to say thank you. And then I'm going to pass the mic off to Miss Ashley.
Yes, thank you so much. So we want to, I put a little prompt into the chat. Around this time is where we usually have folks sharing resources that maybe help them to heighten their awareness or build skills or actions towards generational trauma. I always find out about like a book or a movie or a show or something that kind of gets at generational trauma. So if you have some ideas, please share those in the chat for the rest of us to be able to benefit from. And then at this time, I think we have about 8 minutes remaining. So we wanted to open the floor for any questions or comments that you all might have, whether you put those into the chat, or I think you're able to unmute yourself in this meeting. So we invite you to do either of those things. I do see a comment about how you're going to get a copy of the presentation. I know that we're going to share the slides with CSJ, and I think maybe they'll send out an email to the attendees with the copy of the slides. So that being said, thank you all for your participation in the chat, and we invite you to share any questions that you might have for us.
I don't necessarily have a question, but amazing presentation. And Ashley, ever since that qual class I took where we had talked about your predicts, this has been something that I've been following and really having conversations about with folks in my hometown. And I'm just appreciate this and these resources because I've been engaging with other folks. And I think this is just really helpful. And your dissertation and predicts have been really helpful. So I'm grateful that you all did this, and I'm so grateful that you were able to engage with other folks, and now, you know, Dieta and Marche, you all are doing this work. So just want to say thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. We appreciate you for popping in on us and sharing some personal and professional connections to this work. I think that's the beauty of doing generational trauma work. I often get clients and colleagues who are white that say, I'm not Black, I'm not ethnic minority, but I think that I have this too. And I'm like, you probably do. It's not a phenomenon that is unique to Black folks. We talk about it from our experience and our research, of course, but we know a lot of these processes and things are also applicable to other populations. So thank you for sharing that, Dr. Robertson. Thank you for popping in.
I had a question. Earlier, someone mentioned clients conceptualizing trauma issues in terms of curses. And so I just wondered, how do you talk to clients about that idea? And like, what is the balance that you attempt to maintain toward, I guess, respecting that cultural perspective, but then bringing the psychological components into their understanding as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have definitely, and I lean in with my clients. I've let them know, you know, like this, how we can normalize this language and give them some of that psycho ed as much as I can as I'm doing the work with them, but working with that language that they currently have and using that to reinforce how what this looks like and how we can develop change. And so it's, for me, it's not about coming in and changing any language or correcting any language for them. For me, it was one of those things where, and if the client will ask, or if I've been in classroom settings and folks ask, I'm like, for me, it was one of those things where that was my family's language and how they were able to understand what was happening in the family dynamic. And as I went to school and had the privilege of going to school, understanding that, you know, this is what we call it, which is generational trauma. And so how do I then go back to my family, have I go back to other clients and lean in with them and let them know, like, hey, from this psychoeducation piece, this is what this looks like, this is what this is called. And now that we know how to title it, whether it's curses or generational trauma and things like that, what's the goal? What do we want to do with this now that we know that what it's called, we have this awareness? And so we've called it into the room. And so now how do we find solutions, right, to better understand this, to better cope with what we've been experiencing? And so that's how I have used it with myself and with clients.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for that, Marche. I wanted to chime in and thank you for that great question, Janae. I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Janae? Okay. I know for me, personally, when that's come up a few times in sessions, and I often like to steer clients away from the term generational curse because it really indicates like an external locus of control, like it's something that has happened to our family that we can't change, like it's a curse, it's forever, it's gonna endure through generations. And that also reminds me of the movie Encanto, if you all have seen it. Because it really does like portray itself as like this curse, this thing that has happened to the family. But what we see happen in the movie is that they do interrupt the cycle. People become aware of how they're contributing to the cycle and their roles and their unofficial roles in the family, the official and unofficial. So I really like to really replace that with the term generational trauma, because what we know about trauma is that we can heal from trauma. We can change our gene expression. We can change the way that our bodies react to trauma. And so I like to change that language, but I will say that comes with a caveat. I know sometimes folks really identify with that term because it has like a spiritual connotation to it. And so if that's something that they're adamant about identifying with, I kind of parallel it to the conversation about like, are you a victim or are you a survivor? And how people feel comfortable describing themselves. Even if, you know, they feel like they've survived the trauma, they feel like they're still living. So it just depends on the, you know, the individual and what they prefer. But I prefer to shy away from it because it indicates that maybe we can't change this, when as clinicians and through research, we know that we can. And that's what we're aiming to do through our work with clients. So that's my two cents about the generational curses, that piece. But I think it's an ongoing conversation. Of course, that's not a clinical term. You're not going to see that in the literature anywhere, but that might be something that, you know, you see or hear within session. Great question.
I want us to continue to have time for questions and answers since we have a little extra space. But I just wanted to thank you all and go ahead and pause the recording so that you all can feel free to share any questions or concerns. And I'll make the quick announcement as well to make sure to look in the chat for your surveys. So this will give us a nice opportunity to receive feedback on today's presentation and for you to receive CEs for your attendance. I'll send one more announcement at the very end about how you can also be presenters with our proposals that are going out both for grad students and for non-grad students. So, but I just wanted to pause the recording for now. So thank you all.